Hello and welcome to the Political Opinions podcast, where every opinion is given equal footing and political tolerance and debate are given their proper attention in a world where both are on the decline. Today's episode will cover the different opinions on the effects that violent video games have on people and if there is a case for something to be done about it. Throughout history, people have turned to forms of media to try and explain or warn of possible unintended consequences of their use. From newspapers ending social interaction in the 1800s to television promoting risque attitudes on a number of issues in the 1900s, media is often a focal point of criticism. This idea is never more prevalent than today with the stigma that surrounds violent video games and their effects on people. This podcast will not aim to prove whether or not video games do indeed cause people to be violent or have other negative consequences, but rather will focus on the different opinions groups have towards violent video games. I will begin by outlining the case that violent video games are bad for a multitude of reasons, followed by the arguments in favour of video games, and will then provide a comparison between them at the end. The core argument that violent video games are bad is essentially the idea that it leads to negative behaviour. This is most often vocalised as people becoming desensitised to violence through their constant exposure in video games. It is argued that video games with violence in them are so commonplace and so widely played that people who are exposed to them lose any response to real-life violence. Essentially, it's the idea that if you see hundreds of people being killed in a video game, your response to seeing hundreds of people being killed in real life is greatly diminished as a result. This has been used to claim that video games can cause mass shootings and violent criminal acts. For example, Donald Trump has pointed out how many mass shooters in the USA have played violent video games, and therefore, by being desensitized to the violence, they are less likely to consider the despicable actions they commit. Often a link has been put between the Columbine High School shooter and the fact that he played violent video games as a case that people who play violent video games are more likely to commit violent crimes. Further, violent video games have been accused of training people how to commit these crimes. For example, a man was once arrested for stealing a taxi, claiming he got the idea from GTA 5. Essentially, it pans down to that video games are so realistic that they can be seen as effective training tools to prepare would-be criminals on how to commit their acts of crime. It is also claimed that if people idolise violent video game characters, then they're more likely to copy the acts of violence through a fantasy of said character. There have been many studies linking exposure to video games to more acts of violence, both in the realms of domestic violence, abuse, bullying, harassment, and more. And it's argued that the more you play video games, the less you can distinguish between reality and the fantasy of the video game, and therefore the chances of you committing violent acts in real life are greatly increased by the fact that you constantly commit violent acts in video games. Furthermore, there is no accountability on a game. Someone can commit a murder and nothing would happen, leading to a distortion of what would happen in real life. Violent video games are often accused of glorifying violence to the extent that they promote fighting as the best means to resolve conflict, and often people are more likely to be violent as a result of playing video games rather than perhaps talking or using other non-violent means to resolve conflict. Video games are so widespread and available that the problems of being desensitized to violence, glorifying violence, and essentially training people to commit crime are made worse, and the idea that it becomes harder to distinguish between real life and video games can be seen with the ever-increasing graphical quality of video games. For example, VR games are extremely realistic and they're very immersive, and therefore it's going to become harder over time for people to actually distinguish between violent video games and real life. And if they're constantly committing violence in video games and nothing ever comes of it, then it's argued they're more likely to commit it in real life. Arguments ultimately revolve around the exposure to violence and the glorification of violence. On the other side, essentially in favour that video games are not bad, there are many arguments. First of all, when you look at the facts, juvenile violence in the USA has declined over the last 20 years, while violent video games have increased exponentially, and therefore a lot of people would use this to argue that there isn't an actual link between them. and this is further used to question the validity of studies proving violence in video games causes violence in real life. And often a lot of studies are cited that have found no link between video games and violence. Instead, a lot of these people would point to the fact that video games are essentially used as a scapegoat. They're used by politicians and the media as an excuse which blames individuals for their actions based on video games, rather than addressing the real failings which cause these issues. For example, if someone were to commit a mass shooting, it's argued that it's easier to blame video games for causing violence, rather than the failure of mental health support and, for example, vetting whether or not someone can buy a gun, for example. And therefore it's much easier to blame video games than address the real problems. And this has gone even further. There are claims that Trump has politicised video games, essentially in this idea that most of Trump's supporters are much older, essentially in the boomer category, and therefore it's easier to blame the youth on something the youth themselves have done by playing video games than blaming Trump, the generation of which Trump's main support group comes from, for an increase in violence. Another argument is that violent people are already violent before playing video games. Essentially that someone who would be aggressive, who would commit acts, who would do all these terrible things, would do it without video games. Essentially this idea that correlation is not the same as causation. You don't become violent by playing video games, but violent people do play video games. Furthermore, it's actually argued in some cases that video games can reduce violence in the real world. For example, you can let out your frustration in a video game by whatever you want to do in a video game. You can let out your frustration that way, and therefore there's a positive element, because by doing that you are essentially committing crimes in a video game rather than in real life, which even on the most almost cynical level is still arguably better on the basis that I'd rather see 100 people killed in a video game than people killed in real life. Furthermore, people play video games in a fantasy. Most people play to escape the real world, and therefore to argue that they would bring the real world into video games is often questioned. Essentially this idea that people are more aware than they're often given credit. People are more aware of the distinction between video games and reality than a lot of people think. Especially there's this argument that those who criticise video games are often not the people who play video games, and therefore essentially they're claiming that people who play video games don't know the difference between the real life and the video game. However, those people don't play video games themselves, so how would they know whether that's true or not? Furthermore, similar to blaming violent movies in the past for causing more violence, it's argued that older people are scared of new technology and would try to get rid of it and push it away and make it seem bad, and that's just a kind of an age disparity. A lot of young people would claim that old people don't actually have a problem with video games, they're just kind of scared of this new technology. Furthermore, video games have often been claimed to actually teach people the difference between violence in a video game and violence in real life, in the means that you can explore violent actions in a video game without consequences, which can teach people good and bad and help them explore their morality without having to go into the real world to do it. And the main argument is essentially the idea that almost every young boy in America plays video games, but not every young boy in America is violent. Not everyone who plays video games is violent, and therefore there's not this direct link that a lot of people would claim there is, and it's rather just violent people who play video games, not video games causing violent people. And essentially this idea revolves around the fact that there is a disparity between causation and correlation, which people who criticise video games often don't take into consideration, as well as the fact that video games are often claimed as a kind of a quick scapegoat for bigger problems. Moving on now to a comparison of the main points. Firstly, there's this idea that video games cause violence. Those in favour would say that exposure to violence makes you more violent. The glorification of all of these violent acts therefore makes people more violent as a result. Whereas on the other side would say that it's not true, and that violent people would be violent regardless of the video games they play. They're not made violent because of the video games, but rather other factors. And that while there is a correlation between violence and people who play violent video games, it's not a direct causation. In regard to desensitizing violence, those in favour would say that you see so much violence, and it's never really a problem in video games, at least not to the same extent, that people no longer respond the same way to violence, and they may think of it as not as bad as it is in reality because they've been exposed to it so much. While those on the other side would actually claim that by being exposed to so much violence, it's an exploration of what is good and bad to an individual, as well as this awareness that a video game is very different to reality. In the idea of causing mass shootings and other crimes, those in favour would say that video games can be used as almost a training tool for people, and that by playing these video games they have a better understanding of how to go commit these crimes in real life. While those on the other side would say that while people commit crimes in video games, they're not going to always do that in real life, and often it's better to commit crimes in a video game and let it all your frustration that way rather than doing it in real life, and that instead video games are used as a scapegoat for other problems that are too difficult or maybe too big for whatever reason to address by politicians and the media, and therefore they just use video games as a quick scapegoat instead. Regarding the idea of don't know reality and fantasy, those in favour would say that video games are very realistic, immersive and accessible, and therefore it's getting increasingly difficult to tell the difference between reality and video games, where those on the other side would say that people are capable of telling the difference between fake and real in regards to video games, and that people should be essentially more positive and optimistic about the psychological functioning of a person's brain in regard to their perception of reality and fantasy. In regard to there being no accountability, those in favour would say that people can do whatever they want in a video game and there's no consequences, and therefore that blurs the lines of what they can actually get away with in the real world, and they're more likely to push boundaries and commit these things because perhaps their perception of what is good and bad has been blurred due to the lack of accountability. Well, on the other side, it's argued that people, yes, they can commit crimes without accountability and they can do violent things, but in doing so, it allows them to explore these bad things and develop their own morality without any consequences, given that it's a fake world, and that you shouldn't just assume that a lack of accountability can lead to them just believing that they can go do whatever they want in the real world. In regards to turning the youth violent, those in favour would say that so many youth play it and glorify it that essentially they're more likely to be violent. They would point to studies and things like that which show that violent video games and the youth are linked between each other. While on the other side would point again to the fact that juvenile violence and crime has declined while violent video game sales have gone up, and correlation does not equal causation. In this view that old people are almost restricting new technology, those in favour would say that they're just recognising the danger of a video game, while the youth aren't. While on the other side, younger people would probably say that they're scared of a new technology and that everything in the past has been blamed for something, that newspapers, phones, computers, movies, every form of media and technology has almost been blamed at some point for something bad. In regards to other forms of media, people may say that it's just as bad, essentially like violence in movies is just as bad as in video games, but it's more likely that they'd say that video games are more immersive and real than a movie, and the fact that you're controlling the actions, you're not just witnessing them, and therefore you're more likely to be immersed into a violent lifestyle on the basis that you can do it yourself. Well, on the other side, again, it just points to the idea that people are aware of the difference and that there isn't a direct cause between the two. And then finally, looking at the science, the idea that one side claims studies showing video games cause more violence, the other side claim that these studies are criticised and flawed and would point to studies showing there is no link. So essentially, each side cites whichever studies support its group. Ultimately, your view on whether or not video games can cause violence depends upon your perspective. Most people who play video games would vouch that it doesn't make them violent, while those who don't play video games would claim that they're in denial and probably don't recognise it. There are other factors at play, such as age, culture, which people you listen to, what news you listen to especially can affect your view on it. So it's very much a divisive issue and based on your individual perspective. But the main disparity in viewpoints are essentially whether or not people are able to recognise a perception between reality and fantasy and how that applies to their actions in the real world. There are many scientific studies on both sides which are used to argue either side's case, and although studies that show video games don't cause violence are more supported in general, just numerically, by the scientific community, many people would still vouch that it's the other way around, and there are, again, a lot of studies that do prove the argument that video games can cause violence. However, the question on whether those are valid depends again on your point of view. And this whole issue is, again, just based on the individual. There's no clear right or wrong answer, and it depends on your own personal opinion. However, the most common viewpoint people are approaching nowadays is essentially that you limit the sale of violent video games to younger people, and then once you're a fully grown adult and you're able to recognise the difference between reality and fantasy and things like that, then people should essentially be allowed to do what they want. This is a case for, again, Western liberal democracy. I looked on last video on individual rights. The most common response nowadays is just to say it's the individual's choice and that we should focus on other issues rather than just blaming video games. But ultimately, what do you think? Anything I got wrong, missed, could do better? Let me know in the comments or on Twitter. And if you enjoyed this, be sure to check back on Monday at 7 PM GMT for the different opinions on the approach to political tolerance. So, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.